Section 14 of The Harmony of the Evangelists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Harmony of the Evangelists by St. Augustine of Hippo. Translated by S.D.F. Salmond. Book 2, Chapters 29 through 33. Chapter 29. Of the two blind men and the dumb demoniac, whose stories are related only by Matthew. 69. Matthew proceeds with his narrative in the following terms. And when Jesus departed thence, two blind men followed him, crying and saying, Thou Son of David, have mercy on us, and so on, down to the verse where we read, But the Pharisees said, He casteth out devils through the prince of devils. Matthew is the only one who introduces this account of the two blind men and the dumb demoniac. For those two blind men, whose story is given also by the others, are not the two before us here. Nevertheless, there is such similarity in the occurrences that if Matthew himself had not recorded the latter incident as well as the former, it might have been thought that the one which he relates at present has also been given by these other two evangelists. There is this fact, therefore, which we ought to bear carefully in mind, namely, that there are some occurrences which resemble each other. For we have a proof of this in the circumstance that the very same evangelist mentions both incidents here. And thus, if at any time we find any such occurrences narrated individually by the several evangelists, and discover some contradiction in the accounts, which seems not to admit of being solved on the principle of harmonizing, it may occur to us that the explanation simply is that this apparently contradictory circumstance did not take place on that particular occasion, but that what did happen then was only something resembling it, or something which was gone about in a similar manner. Chapter 30. Of the section where it is recorded that being moved with compassion for the multitudes, he sent his disciples, giving them power to work cures, and charged them with many instructions, directing them how to live, and of the question concerning the proof of Matthew's harmony here with Mark and Luke, especially on the subject of the staff, which Matthew says the Lord told him they were not to carry, while according to Mark it is the only thing they were to carry, and also of the wearing of the shoes and coats. 70. As to the events next related, it is true that their exact order is not made apparent by Matthew's narrative. For after the notices of the two incidents in connection with the blind men and the dumb demoniac, he continues in the following manner. And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, and preaching the kingdom of the gospel, and healing every sickness and every disease. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them, because they were troubled and prostrate, as sheep having no shepherd. Then saith he unto his disciples, The harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore that the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers into his harvest. And when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, he gave them power against unclean spirits, and so forth, down to the words, Verily I say unto you, he shall not lose his reward. This whole passage, which we have now mentioned, shows how he gave many counsels to his disciples. But whether Matthew has subjoined this section in its historical order, or has made its order dependent only on the succession in which it came up to his own mind, as has already been said, is not made apparent. Mark appears to have handled this paragraph in a succinct method, and to have entered upon its recital in the following terms. And he went round about the villages, teaching in their circuit. And he called unto him the 12, and began to send them by 2 and 2, and gave them power over unclean spirits, and so on, down to where we read, Shake off the dust from your feet for a testimony against them. But before narrating this incident, Mark has inserted, immediately after the story of the raising of the daughter of the ruler of the synagogue, on account of what took place on that occasion on which, in his own country, The people were astonished at the Lord, and asked from whence he had such wisdom and such capabilities, when they perceived his judgment, which account is given by Matthew after these counsels to the disciples, and after a number of other matters. It is uncertain, therefore, whether what has happened in his own country has been recorded by Matthew in succession in which it came to mind, after having been omitted at the first, or whether it has been introduced by Mark in the way of an anticipation, and which of them, in short, has kept the order of actual occurrence, and which of them the order of his own recollection. Luke, again, in immediate succession to the mention of the raising of the daughter of Jairus to life, subjoins this paragraph, bearing on the power and the counsels given to the disciples, and that indeed with as great brevity as Mark. This evangelist, however, does not, any more than the others, introduce the subject in such a way as to produce the impression that it comes in also the strictly historical order. Moreover, with regard to the names of the disciples, Luke, who gives their names in another place, that is to say, in the earlier passage, where they are represented as being chosen on the mountain, is not at variance in any respect with Matthew, with the exception of the single instance of the name of Judas, the brother of James, who Matthew designates Thaddeus, although some codices also read Lebbaeus. But who would ever think of denying that one man may be known under 2 or 3 names? 71. Another question which it is also usual to put is this: how comes it that Matthew and Luke have stated that the Lord said to his disciples that they were not to take a staff with them, whereas Mark puts the matter in this way, and he commanded them that they should take nothing for their journey save a staff only, and proceeds further in this strain: no scrip, no bread, no money in their purse, thereby making it quite evident that his narrative belongs to the same place and circumstances with which the narratives of the others deal who have mentioned that the staff was not to be taken. Now this question admits of being solved on the principle of understanding that the staff, according to Mark, was to be taken, bears one sense, and the staff, according to Matthew and Luke, was not to be taken with them, is to be interpreted in a different sense. Just in the same way as we find the term temptation used in one meaning when it is said, God tempteth no man, and in a different meaning where it is said, the Lord your God tempteth, proveth you, to know whether ye love him. For in the former case the temptation of seduction is intended, but in the latter the temptation of probation. Another parallel occurs in the case of the term judgment, which must be taken in one way, where it is said, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of judgment, and in another way, where it is said, judge me, O God, and discern my cause, in respect of an ungodly nation. For the former refers to the judgment of damnation, and the latter to the judgment of discrimination. 72. And there are many other words which do not retain one uniform signification, but are introduced so as to suit a variety of connections, and thus are understood in a variety of ways, and sometimes indeed are adopted along with an explanation. We have an example in the saying, Be not children in understanding. Howbeit in malice be ye little children, that in understanding ye may be perfect. For here is a sentence which, in a brief and pregnant form, might have been expressed thus: Be ye not children, howbeit be ye children. The same is the case with the words, If any man among you thinketh himself to be wise in this world, let him become a fool that he may be wise. For what else is the statement there but this? Let him not be wise, that he may be wise. Moreover, the sentences are sometimes so put as to exercise the judgment of the inquirer. An instance of this kind occurs in what is said in the epistle of the Galatians, Bear ye one another's burdens, and so ye will fulfill the law of Christ. But if a man thinketh himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. But it is meet that every man should prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself and not in another. for every man shall bear his own burden. Now, unless the word burden can be taken in different senses, without doubt one would suppose that the same writer contradicts himself in what he says here, and that too when the words are placed in such close neighborhood in one paragraph. For when he has just said one shall bear another's burdens, after the lapse of a very brief interval he says, every man shall bear his own burden. But the one refers to the burden which are to be borne in sharing in one's infirmity, the other to the burdens borne in the rendering of an account of our own actions to God. The former are burdens to be borne in our duties of fellowship with brethren. The latter are those peculiar to ourselves and borne by every man for himself. And in the same way, once more, the rod of which the apostle spoke in the words, "Shall I come unto you with a rod?" is meant in a spiritual sense, while the same term bears the literal meaning when it occurs of the rod applied to a horse or used for some other purpose of the kind, not to mention, in the meantime, also other metaphorical significations of this phrase. 73. Both these counsels, therefore, must be accepted as having been spoken by the Lord to the apostles, namely, at once they should not take a staff, and that they should take nothing save a staff only. For when he said to them, according to Matthew, "Provide neither gold nor silver nor money in your purses, nor scrip for your journey, neither 2 coats, neither shoes, nor yet a staff," he added immediately, "For the workman is worthy of his meat." And by this he makes it sufficiently obvious why it is that he would have them provide and carry none of these things. He shows that his reason was not that these things are not necessary for the sustenance of this life, but because he was sending them in such a manner as to declare plainly that these things were due to them by those very persons who were to hear believingly the gospel preached by them, just as the wages are the soldiers' due, and as the fruit of the vine is the right of the planters, and the milk of the flock the right of the shepherds. For which reason Paul also speaks in this wise, "Who goeth a warfare any time at his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard, and eateth not of the fruit thereof? Who feedeth a flock, and eateth not of the milk of the flock?" For under these figures he was speaking of those things which are necessary to the preachers of the gospel. And so, a little further on, he says, "If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? If others are partakers of this power over you, are we not rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power." This makes it apparent that by these instructions the Lord did not mean that the evangelists should not seek their support in any other way than by depending on what was offered them by those to whom they preached the gospel. Otherwise, this very apostle acted contrary to this precept when he acquired a livelihood for himself by the labors of his own hands, because he would not be chargeable to any of them, but he gave them a power in the exercise of which they should know such things to be their due. Now, when any commandment is given by the Lord, there is the guilt of non-obedience if it is not observed. But when any power is given, anyone is at liberty to abstain from its use, and, as it were, to recede from his right. Accordingly, then, when the Lord spake these things to the disciples, he did what that apostle expounds more clearly a little further on, when he says, "Do ye not know that they who minister in the temple live of the things of the temple? And they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. But I have used none of these things." When he says, therefore, that the Lord ordained it thus, but that he did not use the ordinance, he certainly indicates that it was a power to use that was given him, and not a necessity of service that was imposed upon him. 74. Accordingly, as our Lord ordained what the apostle declares him to have ordained, namely, that those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel, he gave these counsels to the apostles, in order that they might be without the care of providing or of carrying with them things necessary for this life, whether great or the very smallest. Consequently, he introduced this term, neither a staff, with the view of showing that, on the part of those who were faithful to him, all things were due to his ministers, who themselves, too, required nothing superfluous. And thus, when he added the words, "For the workman is worthy of his meat," he indicated quite clearly, and made it thoroughly plain, how and for what reason it was that he spake all these things. It is this kind of power, therefore, that the Lord denoted under the term staff, when he said that they should take nothing for their journey, save a staff only. For the sentence might also have been briefly expressed in this way: "Take with you none of the necessaries of life, neither a staff, save a staff only." So that the phrase "neither a staff" may be taken to be equivalent to not even the smallest things, while the addition "save a staff only" may be understood to mean that in virtue of that power which they received from the Lord, and which was signified by the name staff or rod, even those things which were not carried with them would not be wanting to them. Our Lord, therefore, used both phrases. But inasmuch as one and the same evangelist has not recorded them both, the writer who has told us that the rod, as introduced in the one sense, was to be taken, is supposed to be in antagonism to him who has told us that the rod, as occurring again in the other sense, was not to be taken. After this explanation of the matter, however, no such supposition ought to be entertained. 75. In like manner also, when Matthew tells us that the shoes were not to be carried with them on the journey, what is intended is the checking of that care which thinks that such things must be carried with them, because otherwise they might be unprovided. Thus, too, the import of what is said regarding the 2 coats is that none of them should think of taking with him another coat in addition to the one in which he was clad, as if he was afraid that he might come to be in want, while all the time the power which was received from the Lord made him sure of getting what was needful. To the same effect, when Mark says that they were to be shod with sandals or shoes, he gives us to understand that this matter of the shoe has some sort of mystical signification, the point being that the foot is to be neither covered nor yet left bare to the ground, by which the idea may be conveyed that the gospel was neither to be concealed, yet made to depend on the good things of the earth. And as to the fact that what is forbidden is neither the carrying nor the possessing of 2 coats, but more distinctly the putting of them on, the words being, "and not put on 2 coats," what counsel is conveyed to them therein, but this, that they ought to walk not in duplicity, but in simplicity. And as to the fact that what is forbidden is neither the carrying nor the possessing of 2 coats, but more distinctly the putting of them on, the words being, "and not to put on 2 coats," what counsel is conveyed to them therein but this, that they ought to walk not in duplicity, but in simplicity. 76. Thus it is not by any means to be made a matter of doubt that the Lord himself spake all these words, some of them with a literal import, and others of them with a figurative, although the Evangelists may have introduced them early in part into their writings, one inserting one section and another giving a different portion. Certain passages at the same time have been recorded in identical terms either by some 2 of them, or by some 3, or even by all the 4 together. And yet not even when this is the case can we take it for granted that everything has been committed to writing, which was either uttered or done by him. Moreover, some discourse may have used some expressions with a figurative application, and others with a literal. Let him but examine his other addresses, and he will see how rash and inconsiderate such a notion is. For then, to mention but a single instance which occurs meantime to my mind, when Christ gives the counsel not to let the left hand know what the right hand doeth, He may suppose himself under the necessity of accepting in the same figurative sense at once the almsgivings themselves referred to, and the other instructions offered on that occasion. 77. In good truth, I must repeat here once more an admonition which it behoves the reader to keep in mind, so as not to be requiring that kind of advice so very frequently, namely, that in various passages of his discourses the Lord has reiterated much which he had uttered already on other occasions. It is needful indeed to call this fact to mind, lest when it happens that the order of such passages does not appear to fit in with the narrative of another of the Evangelists, the reader should fancy that this establishes some contradiction between them, whereas he ought really to understand it to be due to the fact that something is repeated a second time in that connection, which had been already expressed elsewhere. And this is a remark that should be held applicable not only to his words, but also to his deeds. For there is nothing to hinder us from believing that the same thing may have taken place more than once. But for a man to impeach the gospel simply because he does not believe in the repeated occurrence of some incident, which no one at least can prove to be an impossible event, betrays more sacrilegious vanity. Chapter 31. Of the account given by Matthew and Luke of the occasion when John the Baptist was in prison, and dispatched his disciples on a mission to the Lord. 78. Matthew proceeds with his narrative in the following terms. And it came to pass, when Jesus had made an end of commanding his 12 disciples, he departed thence to teach and to preach in their cities. Now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples, and said unto him, Art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? And so on, until we come unto the words, And wisdom is justified of her children. This whole section relating to John the Baptist, touching the message which he sent to Jesus, and the tenor of the reply which those whom he dispatched received, and the terms in which the Lord spoke of John after the departure of these persons, is introduced also by Luke. The order, however, is not the same, but it is not made clear which of them gives the order of his own recollections, and which keeps by the historical succession of the things themselves. Chapter 32. Of the occasion on which he upbraided the cities because they repented not, which incident is recorded by Luke as well as by Matthew, and of the question regarding Matthew's harmony with Luke in the matter of the order. 79. Thereafter Matthew goes on as follows. Then began he to upbraid the cities wherein most of his mighty works were done, because they repented not. And so on, down to where we read, It shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom at the day of judgment than for you. This section likewise is given by Luke, who reports it also as an utterance from the lips of the Lord, in connection with a certain continuous discourse which he delivered. This circumstance makes it the rather appear that Luke has recorded these words in the strict consecution, in which they were spoken by the Lord, while Matthew has kept by the order of his own recollections. Or if it is supposed that Matthew's words, Then began he to upbraid the cities, must be taken in such a way as to imply that the intention was to express, by the term then, the precise point of time at which the saying was uttered, and not to signify in a somewhat broader way the period at which many of these things were done and spoken, then I say that anyone entertaining that idea may equally well believe these sentences to be have pronounced on 2 different occasions. For if it is the fact that even in one and the same evangelist some things are found which the Lord utters twice over, as is the case with this very Luke in the instance of the counsel, not to take a scrip for the journey, and so with other things in like manner which we find to have been spoken by the Lord in 2 different places, why should it seem strange if some other word of the Lord, which was originally uttered on 2 separate occasions, may happen also to be recorded by 2 several evangelists, each of whom gives it in the order in which it was actually spoken, And if thus the order seems to be different in the two, simply because the sentences were uttered both on the occasion noticed by the one and on that referred to by the other? Chapter 33. Of the occasion on which he calls them to take his yoke and burden upon them, and of the question as to the absence of any discrepancy between Matthew and Luke in the order of narration. 80. Matthew proceeds thus: At that time Jesus answered and said, I make my acknowledgment to thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and so on down to where we read, For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This passage is also noticed by Luke, but only in part, for he does not give us the words, Come unto me, all ye that labor, and the rest. It is, however, quite legitimate to suppose that all this may have been said on one occasion by the Lord, and yet that Luke has not recorded the whole of what was said on that occasion. For Matthew's phrase is that at that time Jesus answered and said, by which is meant the time after his upbraiding of the cities. Luke, on the other hand, interposes some matters, although they are not many, after that upbraiding of the cities, and then he subjoins this sentence: In that hour he rejoiced in the Holy Spirit, and said. Thus, too, we see that even if Matthew's expression had been not at that time, but in that very hour, still what Luke inserts in the interval is so little that it would not appear an unreasonable thing to give it as all spoken in the same hour. End of section 14.